Dr. Stephen Levitt. Thank you so much for joining us. Please introduce yourself.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ryan, for having me today. My name is Dr. Steve Levitt. I've been at UTSA in the communication department for over 30 years, and I've been teaching many different things from public relations to research methods. Currently, I'm teaching international teamwork dynamics, so I do have an intercultural communication background as well. So it's been a great ride at UTSA all these years.
How have people benefited from public relations? Why should people care about public relations?
Well, first, I think we should start with the career opportunities, because that's one reason people should care, because it is a fast-growing career area. The U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics projects about an 11% growth rate from 2020 to 2030, which is higher than the national industry growth rate at 8%. And, advertising and other forms of publicity are getting pretty fragmented in today's media market. So it's really essential now to step back and really work on developing those relationships that create trust between companies and the people that they depend on, their customers, their clients, the public. So it's really important to get that trust. And we'll go through some examples of how public relations has really helped companies, or not so much if they've neglected some things that they should have done. But in the old days, it was, the company said, here's our message, deliver it. And then it became, well, now we kind of need you to tell us what to say, because we're kind of, and now it's tell us what to do. So this implies then that the public relations people really have to be part of the executive suite team to counsel. And that is one of the most important functions of public relations, is counseling management and executives on, actions, potential results of the actions that they might take. Let's look at this from how's the public likely to respond to these kinds of things? So I'm going to read a real quick quote, if you don't mind, because I think it really encapsulates it. James Gruning is one of the most important professors of public relations. He pretty much developed public relations education in the United States. And he said, when public relations helps that organization build relationships, it saves the organization money by reducing the cost of litigation, keeping you out of lawsuits, reducing regulations, legislation, and pressure campaign boycotts, we're going to get to that, or lost revenue that result from bad relationships with the publics. So publics become activist groups when relations are bad. And then that has a lot of negative implications, obviously. So it can also help the organization make money by cultivating relationships with donors, customers, shareholders, and legislators, who can become more favorable in terms of reducing the regulations and those kind of things. So that's a big, broad, sweeping picture of how public relations helps organizations. But there are many other much more specific examples, of course.
As you were discussing the impact and how they have to be in the C-suite, they have to be in that driving the vehicle, driving the car forward, they have to be in that managerial role to a large extent. I started to think about how one of the most exposed, according to some studies, jobs to artificial intelligence is public relations. But at least the artificial intelligence that we know today, who knows what the future holds, but the one that we know today that can write well and may be able to write a press release, it doesn't seem like they're yet able to make the kinds of decisions and manage the kind of relationships. You'd have to have a really intimate relationship to have an AI sitting on the board of a company. And I mean, we may think that's silly now, but that could happen, right? Like that absolutely is where we're headed, right? To have like an AI advisor role that is consulted.
AI is going to be capable of doing many of the old style tactical issues, like writing press releases and sending them out en masse. What's the objective of the release? But let me ask you how artificial intelligence is going to help Anheuser-Busch right now, who had lost well over $5 billion, and their Bud Light sales have gone down 26%. How you tell me how artificial intelligence is going to handle that controversial issue, which now becomes a crisis in terms of the impact on the Anheuser-Busch Corporation. So these are, I just don't know how artificial intelligence is going to manage that. It may manage some issues with, Dylan Mulvaney, I guess that's it. Yeah, Mulvaney, his TikTok for her TikTok followers, because but as far as the traditional Bud Light base, I don't see artificial intelligence speaking to them very well.
It would need a much better theory of mind in order to do that, which we don't have yet, but we're headed in that direction. So that's exciting. It's all conjecture. It's all possibilities. But I think that, thinking about the future in terms of where my job's going to be, it seems to me right now, I need to have AI just like any other tool. I need to have artificial intelligence in my tool bag of things that I'm able to consult with and to use just like any other tool, at least right now.
One of the clear sets of skills that people have is managing social media. I mean, there's a lot of relationship development in using social media with your customers and your clients. There's no question about that, especially with the younger crowd. And by the way, going back to the Anheuser-Busch, I mean, one of the reasons that they went with that transgender spokesperson, that advertising marketing campaign, was because the Bud Light brand has been diminishing over time. And they said, look, if we don't reach out to the younger audience, Bud Light's going to probably go away forever. So it was a new strategy to try to, bring the sales of that back up.
What are some skills that a public relations professional might need to practice public relations today in that C-suite?
This is, I'm going to bring up old school, but writing. And maybe that will be replaced more and more with artificial intelligence. But writing is a skill, because so much of the planning and everything else that you do in public relations starts in written form. A lot of email transactions, of course, but also more formal documents that produce public relations campaign proposals and plans. So it's a lot of writing going on. Problem solving and creativity. We'll talk about creativity because public relations has an opportunity to do some really fun and creative things in addition to, dealing with very controversial issues and crises. So you need good planning skills, being able to plan out the details of some special event or some activity. You need economic skills in terms of business, proposals, budgets. You're not going to be turning into an accountant or, a finance person, because companies have those, but you have to be able to be conversant with that and work with these budgets and proposals. I mentioned broad social media skills. That's probably really something that you just can't get away without having these days. And then, of course, just basic interpersonal communication skills, the ability to go out and have conversations, be persuasive. That's maybe another thing that artificial intelligence might not be quite as good at, is how do I do something like channeling? And this is a skill where you say, okay, here's my target audience, and I've got a message I want to deliver, and I want to persuade them to change their attitudes or their beliefs or their behaviors, whatever it happens to be. I have to therefore know enough about my audience to tailor that message to appeal to their self-interests. So why would college students be interested in learning about retirement planning? It's like, what? That's like way out there. But yet we need to convince them that the earlier they start, the better off they're going to be later on, and they can retire earlier or at least in more comfort, those kind of things. So you have to figure out how to craft the message to appeal to their self-interest at the time that they're. And then the third thing, which brings up social media, the other thing is you must figure out what's the right communication platform to deliver the message. I mean, I always ask this, how many call in my class? How many of you read a newspaper? I'd say once every 3 years, a student might raise their hand. They don't, so that's, who's watching traditional television programs? you have to figure out what media channels your audience is using so that you can deliver the message using the appropriate channels. So those are three threads that, artificial intelligence perhaps can get there, but I don't think it's there now. And there's a lot of subtle, it's a science and it's an art.
I love that. This idea of channeling and understanding the audience. One of the examples I like to use is this idea of the rainforest, because why would we care about making sure rainforest doesn't turn into farmland? Well, it turns out a lot of medicines come from discoveries from the biodiversity that is still locked up in the rainforest. Finding that rare animal or that rare piece of nature that can instruct us on how to live better or create better pharmaceuticals that then can extend our lives. So emphasizing that selfish appeal really has a big impact on the way that we choose to frame things. I wonder, do you have a PR framework that you teach to your
Oh, there's
students?
several of them. The most notable one, these are acronyms, is probably the RACE acronym, RACE. And so RACE begins with research. What is the situation? It's a basic situation analysis, right? What is the situation? What are the needs of our organization or our group? What do we want? What we need to do? What do we need to accomplish? So you have to do a lot of background research on who needs to be influenced and so forth, and what the current attitudes are, and then you have to do the action part of it, which is the program planning. Okay, so it's research, then you develop an action plan. So you've got your objectives, what you want to achieve. Now you're going into the strategic and tactical issues of what is it that we need to do to accomplish this, and how will we do that? So the strategies are developing certain types of persuasive messages with certain message themes, and the tactics would be always specific communication tools that you're going to use to deliver those messages in interpersonal channels, social media channels, outdoor publicity stunts, so to speak. One of the things I want to talk about at some point is these pseudo events, which are really important, and they're really part of the fun part of public relations. So you got all that. Now you know what you're going to do, and then you communicate. And so you research, you got your action plan, you do all the communications. And at the end, of course, is evaluation. And I do want to point out something important about evaluation, and that is you have to be doing ongoing evaluation during the campaign as soon as it starts, because you have to monitor how well your strategies and tactics are working, because if they're not working, you need to change them. Or if they are working, you need to continue to use them. So you don't want to get to the end of the campaign and figure out, well, that thing never worked at all, so we wasted all that time and that money. So you've got to be doing it ongoing, and then you do the afterward, so that you can say, okay, how did all this work? What can we do better the next time? What did we learn from this? And by the way, that research, this reminded me, because it's a circular process, that research goes back to looking at other kinds of campaigns that you can look for. For example, Don't Trash Arizona is an anti-littering campaign, but that started a long time after the Don't Mess with Texas anti-littering campaign. And so they did a lot of research about what happened in Texas, and they found out that it took about 2 years for that campaign to really start soaking in, to have any really significant impacts. What that tells you is you've got to do this in a hierarchical fashion, and that you can't expect results overnight, and you have to plan for that much time and this much budget and all these other kinds of things. So, it's like, first you have to make people aware of what the dangers of littering are. It's not just that it looks crappy; it causes highway accidents. People die. There's a lot of dangers to highway litter. So why should we care about litter? And then what do we need to do about it? So then you move from changing awareness to changing attitudes and behaviors, which of course is always more difficult to change people's attitudes and behaviors, but you have to keep at it, and keep at it.
I hear different parts of this public relations mix. And I know that, for example, we talk about the difference between earned media and paid media. Can you talk about the difference between advertising and public relations? Because I always thought of advertising as what we pay for, and public relations is what we earn. But it sounds like you're talking about how we mix the two in a good campaign, and we should be thinking about advertising as a part of a public relations function. Is that correct?
Well, but yeah, that goes back to the concept of integrated marketing communications. Okay, so most companies of any size and PR firms will be able to integrate, public relations activity with some level of advertising. But here's a couple of things to keep it in mind. We want our stories ideally covered as news items, because news is always perceived as more credible than advertising. I mean, I'm going to give you my opinion. There's no truth in advertising. People say whatever they want, and there's no real I mean, how many best country fried chicken places have you ever seen around the country? I've seen hundreds of them. There can't be 100 best anyway. So get it as news. So advertising is paid space. You have control. It's also known as controlled and uncontrolled media, because control, you pay for it. You get to say whatever you want within, legal limits of not being, pornographic, or, what I'm saying. But then there's uncontrolled media. So we have to send our information to the news media gatekeepers, editors, who are going to decide, is this newsworthy or not? And if it is newsworthy, how much of this are we going to use, and how are we going to piece it together? So once that gets completely out of your control, and you've heard about people complaining that, that was all taken out of context, so you lose control over all that. But it is perceived as more credible. So that's why we have to do media relations and form good relationships with the media gatekeepers and send them newsworthy information. The other important thing to keep in mind is the news media has nowhere near enough people and resources to cover all the possible news stories. They can't. So they have to focus on the really big things that are on fire during the day. They rely heavily on public relations practitioners to send them content. And so this is a really huge opportunity for public relations practitioners to shape public opinion. So that's the difference. I was going to talk a little bit about publicity, because we have sort of the more mundane publicity. I call it mundane, but it's really important about telling your story. For UTSA, we have a lot of stories to tell about. Athletics has become real popular, of course, with the football team, and but also our research, our community outreach efforts. We need to be telling our stories about the good things going on at UTSA, just like other companies need to do. But there's other opportunities to get publicity as news stories that's more fun and more interesting, and can really sort of engage the audience members. And there's a couple of examples. One that happened just a couple of years ago was the NFL, National Football League, took soil from 29 NFL stadiums, and they grew potatoes in those soils, and they made Lay's potato chips out of the soil that came from. So now you've got Lay's potato chips that were grown from, the Green Bay Packers state, Lambeau Field in Green Bay, and you have your customized bag with your color and your team's logo on it. I mean, that's just sort of clever, in my opinion, that as a sort of marketing tool, and it get a lot of news coverage, you see. And then Oscar Mayer did another fun one that I like. I love reading how this guy drove all the way across country with 2,000 pounds of Oscar Mayer bacon. No money, no credit card, nothing. Everything he did from one end of the country to the other had to be done by bartering the Oscar Mayer bacon. Gasoline, taxi rides, hotel, anything like that. He had a psychic reading by I mean, there's all this wacky stuff going on, and there's so many news stories about this following this guy along, and that's really kind of fun, engaging things. And then there's other a little bit more serious ones, like a naked woman painted as a tiger in a cage in downtown San Antonio, protesting the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers circus with treatment from animals. That's going to cause some attention too. So these pseudo events, these publicity events, are part of the creative, element, as well as special event planning. And how are you going to make an event really engaging and fun for people to come and raise money for for a charitable cause, something like that. We were fortunate enough years ago to be our public relations students, and myself were fortunate enough to be part of the grand opening of the Retama Park here in San Antonio, which is a race. And then the governor came, and there was this huge soiree in the new Retama Park racing field, and it was a very big event. And the amount of planning that goes on for an event like that is just extraordinary. And PR people have to be involved in all that.
I wonder if you have any other frameworks that will help shed light on these kinds of events, the events that really grab those headlines and create good word of mouth for public relations.
Well, again, it's about understanding. First of all, the process begins by forming your objectives. What is it that you want to get done here? Does big brothers, big sisters need people to understand that it doesn't take as much time as they think to really make a difference in that organization? We had them as a client for one of our PR courses, and their research that they started with told them that was the number one barrier against people volunteering, is they thought it was going to take too much time. So voila, the objective, the message, themes, and so forth. And so it's about getting those objectives done, and then who do we need to reach, and how do we craft our messages to tailor to their self-interest? So that channeling is really probably the backbone of what we're doing here. When you get into some more specific kinds of things, like there's a whole nother set of concepts for crisis communication. I mean, there's obviously a lot of crisis communication preparation. Like, all right, we have a plan in place in case this happens. A lot of it is outside of public relations jurisdiction, so to speak, because it's about maintaining safe workspaces and things like this, so that you don't have an explosion in your plant that kills a bunch of people. A public relations person cannot be involved in making sure that gas leaks aren't going to, but they can be involved in what can we do to make sure we have a plan in place that can be instantly executed if something does. So you got to be prepared. And the research shows that most companies aren't prepared, and they start scrambling. And so that's bad. And then there's a whole long list of crisis do's and don't do's. You've got to have one of those CEOs, one of those executives, the CEO. You got to get that person to the site immediately. People have been criticized that it took the Biden administration, and this isn't a political issue. In some ways, they never did get to that place in Ohio where they had that train derailment, and there was a lot of criticism because the Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, is in charge of those kind of things. So somebody in charge has to get there and start managing how this is going to happen. And then you've got to explain to the public what happened, what we're doing about it, which is really important. And then, what you're learning to prevent this from ever happening again. There's a formula for this. And that's a few of like a dozen steps that you have to have in place for a crisis communication event, for a major disaster. So there's more specific, kinds of all right, here's what we need to do in issues management. So issues management is something where you've got a controversial issue, like this Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light situation. How are we going to handle this? We have to figure out, and it's a risk assessment, right? What is the risk of continuing along this path versus trying to appease the more traditional Bud Light audience, and the public relations person has to be there to help think these things out and help gauge what the possible public response is going to be.
So few companies, so few small businesses, so few organizations have a plan in place to manage a crisis. What would you recommend they start with in creating a crisis communication plan for their business? And I know every business is different, and certain businesses might need to emphasize some things other than over others in their preparation and their plans for what might go wrong. But do you have a framework for crisis management that might fit more businesses?
Everybody in the organization needs to know what they're supposed to do when the media shows up. because you know that they are going to be all over you in a heartbeat if something significant happens. The first and foremost thing is they have to have a designated single spokesperson who is trained to work with the media. And almost all companies have somebody that's like that, or they can hire somebody to come in and handle that. But they have to have a single spokesperson, so there's the consistent message coming across. Because most of the people in the organization have no knowledge, no sufficient knowledge of what happened, and you don't want all these people speculating and rumors generating. So what's my job and your job? When media show up in my office, I refer them to the chief communication officer. That's it. I don't tell them anything else. I say, I'm sorry, I don't have any information about this. This is the person you need to go to. So that's rule number one. And then rule number two, of course, is that you have to make sure that you have good communication lines open. So you need to have good communications going with the first responders, the police, the mayor's office, all these parties that are going to be either directly or indirectly involved in what's happening here, of evacuations or support for victims of an accident. So you have to have all these communicate. And so therefore you need to know who these contact people are at the fire, the police, the mayor's office, the county here, Bexar County, whatever county you're in. You have to have all those contacts. You have to know who they are. You have to have developed a relationship with them so that they know who you are when you call. And then you've developed a level of trust there, hopefully. And that's the trust thing is, I can't emphasize that enough. There's no covering up stuff anymore. There's just no way you're going to get away with that. And you're going to be found out. The longer you cover up and try to minimize what's happening, the worse it's going to look. And of course, the worst possible thing is, well, I don't have a comment about that at this time. What does that sound like? They're hiding something, right? So you cannot say that. You have to say, here's what we know. Here's what we're doing to find out more. And here's what we're doing about, so that's the format. And here's what we're hoping to learn to make sure this doesn't happen again. So the trust thing and the being honest and not trying to cover up things is just essential. It just backfires on you and makes it far worse. So that you can't, so you need all of these people to trust you that they're getting the correct information from you. And that's relationship developing. Artificial intelligence devices are going to have trouble with that.
Exactly. Until we learn to trust the machines, which, given every science fiction movie in history, might prove difficult, right? The kinds of frameworks you're talking about, the kinds of issues you're talking about, the relationship management, the making sure that you have a plan in place, making sure that you have the contact information in place. It sounds like we have a good checklist of things that need to be done before the crisis happens.
Absolutely.
And it has to be done in a way that everybody knows what to do. What happens when they don't know what to do? What happens when they failed to plan ahead, when they didn't create that crisis framework? What's the cost of doing business without a crisis communication plan? And maybe you have an example.
Yeah, well, there's been quite a few faux pas of company CEOs not going to the site right away. But the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico was kind of a classic thing because, this is a British petroleum and they're over there in England. And it took Tony Blair, no, not Tony Blair, I can't remember, I'm sorry, the CEO's name at the time. But it took him quite a while to actually come over here and start dealing with it. And then he's sitting there in front of a bunch of reporters. See, he's clearly not been trained how to deal with the media. And by the way, there's a formula for that we should get to too. So he's there and he's going, this is really, really bad. I wish I had my old life back. It's like, I wish I was waking up from a bad dream. How does that sound? It's like, it was absolute. And the media took that and just denigrated him and just eviscerated him from that. So there's a lot of mistakes that can be made. And then, of course, the worst part about it is when you cover things up and then it turns out later that, the Petrobras, in 2011, I think it was a major, huge oil platform that blew up off the coast of Brazil, Petrobras. 11 workers died, and it was a huge mess and all this kind of stuff. Well, again, the public relations person should have been there. He or she can't stop a gas leak from exploding, but it can say, look, we already know these things are leaking, and we are delaying sending the repair parts out there because it's, that doesn't seem to be as pressing as. So these are self-inflicted problems. They knew the thing was leaking gas. They knew the danger, but they chose to delay doing anything about it. And then suddenly it's too late. Well, now when the media, the public find out that they knew ahead of time that this was a likely thing to happen, how does that look? It looks really bad. Go back to 1986 with the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. Those Morton Thiokol engineers knew ahead of time that it was going to be really bad if it got that cold and they tried to launch, because these O-rings that were sealing the liquid, fuel were not going to seal properly, and this thing could blow up. And sure enough. And so when you pull the threads back, you find out that the NASA managers just simply weren't convinced that this was going to be bad, and that, and they did. And there was a lot of political pressure because it was the first, school teacher astronaut. So there was a lot of political pressure. And so they bent to the politics instead of erring on the side of caution. And it cost NASA pretty dearly. Although I must be honest to say that it wasn't entirely NASA's fault, because the Thiokol engineers were not trained in communication, and they didn't understand how to communicate cause and effect relationships between variables. And so they just didn't put their data and their arguments in a persuasive form that would have an impact on the NASA managers. A whole case study. I wrote a journal article about that whole context. Very fascinating. Anyway.
And incredibly instructive to what can happen whenever communication breaks down in an organization. The NASA safety culture we have today is a result of tragedies like this. And the NASA communication culture is a result of tragedies like this, so that they are able to level up their communication skills in ways that hopefully save lives in the future.
I've been teaching engineering students about this since I got to UTSA over 30 years ago, because one of the professors at the time knew that they needed that. And so we became very good friends. And I continue to go and make presentations to the Intro to Engineering course about this very thing, about how to think causally with quantitative numbers and how to help visualize that to make an impact, to really show what the truth is. Because there's ways to lie with charts and graphs, and I have an example that shows, like our old school newspaper, the Paisano, and it wasn't their fault. They sort of just did this, and they were comparing men and women's GPAs, and it showed the women like 3 times higher than the men, and it made it look like the women were way smarter than the men. But it's because the scale went from like 2.7 up to 3.4 or something like that, instead of a real GPA scale goes 0 to 4. So when you stretch that scale out to show accurately what those lines are doing, suddenly the men's GPA is less than 3% lower than the women's. So you can distort the truth with these kind of things. And some of it's unintentional, but much of it is intentional. The flip side of that is that we, as consumers of this information, need to be savvy enough to know that those tricks can be played. And if you ever see like a bar chart or a line graph or something, and there's no scale to show you what the minimum and maximum values are, man, I'd be so suspicious of that, really, because they can make a lot. Literally, you can make a corporate loss look like a profit by doing that. You can, literally.
What are some of the specific media skills that public relations professionals need to know in order to communicate effectively with the media?
Well, again, I'm going back to the relationship building. You need to know deadlines. What is a newspaper or a television newscast or a radio newscast? What are their deadlines for getting stories on the air? or in print? Who's in charge? Who are the reporters that are on the beat that covers your industry? Who are the media gatekeepers? Who are the editors? You have to know these people so that you visit them and you chat with them about what's going on, and you give them little heads up about what's happening. So you're trying to tease them into being more interested in things that are happening. And so you're developing this relationship so that and you're not sending them frivolous nonsense, disguised advertisements, trying to, get little these media gatekeepers are not stupid, and they recognize that. So if you start sending them a bunch of stuff that you should know they're not going to be interested in, your credibility's out of there. And so you can't afford to do that. So you have to make sure that whatever you're sending them is really newsworthy. They may still not cover it, because, there's something called a news hole. If you know anything about journalism, there's a news hole, and the news hole is whatever's left over after the advertising. Whatever airtime, whatever newspaper pages, or whatever's left over from all the advertising stuff that they need to make money on, that's the news hole. And some days they fit you in a news hole, some days they can't, depending on, you can't control the news cycle of something that's going to go on. I mean, recently, we have this situation where this guy here in Texas, this man, got upset because they asked him to stop firing his gun at night. It was keeping the baby up, and he goes next door and kills all 5 of them. Well, that's been top of the news headlines for 4 days now. Luckily, they just found and arrested the guy yesterday. But so you can't control that, and it may bump your stories off. That's just part of the game. So you need to have those relationships. But when you train people how to interact with the media, there's sort of a simple formula, and it's when you get question asked, never just answer the question. It's answer plus the message is response. So you're getting your message in there as you're answering the question. So you've always got a message that you're trying to get across. Because if you just answer the question they ask, you've lost control over the communications mess. You've lost control over the message. They have control over the message. You want to regain that control over the message. And so it's answer and message is the response. And then you have to put people. So many years ago, we had this really wonderful student. Her name is Catherine Young. And she graduated here, and she went off and worked at the Pentagon training these generals how to interact with the media. And so she came and spoke to our students a few times after that. And I've kind of lost track with her because it's been a long time ago. But she was the one who kind of came up with this idea. This is how you have to interact with the media. And you always stay on that message. And you have to practice with really tough people pretending to be reporters that are going to doggedly go after you and try to get under your skin and ruffle you, get to get a little, upset or something, a little tense, and then you're going to start making mistakes. I mean, obviously, if you're going to go into a political debate against your opponent, hours and hours and hours and hours of practice. If you're going to be giving testimony in a court of law, hours and hours and hours of practice against somebody who's pretending to be a really hardcore attorney, just going after you, and even asking questions that they know the judge is going to declare, that's a sustainable objection. So it's a lot of practice and training. And there's people who have careers that do that.
Well, what are some sources that you recommend, not only for this kind of training or understanding, but for understanding more about how to manage influence as a public relations professional?
Oh, gosh, that's a big question. Well, first of all, the professional trade associations are very good sources of information. I mean, there is a National Public Relations Society of America, and UTSA does have a Public Relations Student Society of America chapter, which is the student chapter. And there's tons of resources for public relations practitioners in those organizations, just like there's for any other trade or industry. And by the way, while we're on this, I'm sorry to take a little bit of a left turn here, but some of the resources are going to be these trade associations, because assume that I'm going to hire you to be part of my public relations firm, and one of our clients happens to be in the trucking industry. What do you know about long haul trucking? Probably not a lot, unless you grew up in a family that did. So if you were going to help your client, you better learn a lot about that in a pretty short period of time. Or chemical manufacturing in South Texas, whatever it happens to be, you got to somehow develop expertise in industries that you've never had a clue about before. And the trade associations are the first place to go. There's always a American Association, or U.S. Association, or National Association of X, Y, and Z. All right. And you have to go there and educate yourself, meet people, go talk to people in the industry, go pick their brains on what's important, what's the current trend. You have to keep up with current events. So people are resources. These sites are resources. The Trade Association for Public Relations is a good resource. There's also some good basic textbook out there. The one that I use in my class is by Wilcox and Cameron. Anyway, we can put that citation up there. But that is the one that the professional organization uses to teach people what they need to know for the certification exam. So you can become an accredited public relations. When you see APR next to somebody's name, that means accredited public relations. That means they've gotten advanced training and are credentialed in that in an advanced way. That's the book that they always use because it's very thorough and very comprehensive, and it's updated pretty regularly. So you've got textbooks, trade associations, websites. The trade associations are usually pretty reliable. The internet is full of a lot of pretty unreliable information, so you have to be a little careful there. But the trade associations are usually going to be very reliable.
I was looking at the APR exam and comparing it to our learning objectives in our courses, and I was really excited to say, hey, we teach this stuff. This absolutely could be taken after taking a public relations course. Not just the text, but the practice that we do in our courses absolutely help you to earn your APR certification.
A necessary learning experience and credential to have that provides more credibility and more trust. Boy, credibility and trust are just two huge concepts that I can't emphasize enough.
Are there any other texts or ideas of where to go for training on public relations?
Well, I think this is a really good new thing that just came along. This is a book written by Melissa Vela Williamson, who is one of our graduates from UTSA, on public relations essentials pros should know. Well, that sounds like it's right up the alley, right? And there's Melissa.
Wonderful.
No, she's one of our graduates. We're really proud of her.
It's always nice when the home team scores big, right? You get to cheer for, any chance we get to cheer for our students, it's exciting.
Yeah, we're very fortunate at UTSA that we have a pretty strong cohort of graduates that are now out there working as professionals. And they stay in touch with us and they help us a lot.
What's a common myth or misunderstanding about public relations?
Well, there's been a lot of misrepresentation of the career in the media. I think there was a series called Sex in the City where, there's a public relations practice. It's a mingling at parties and soirees and all this kind of stuff. And that's just nonsense. This is very, very hard work, long hours, weekends. I mean, when do all these special events happen? Wednesday at 4:00 in the afternoon? No. If you're going to have a big gala to, bring fundraisers and get donations for a social cause, it's going to be on the weekends. And it takes a lot of hard work, a lot of preparation, a lot of logistics. I mean, you got to get parking, you've got to get security, you've got to get permits for food or alcohol or various things. I mean, there's so it's a lot of hard work. So it's not just about mingling at parties and schmoozing around. That's the very small little thing at the end that happens, assuming the planning is all gone. Then you get a few hours of fun. And then it's about hype. One of the reasons that public relations in some lines have bad reputations is because of these, we call them flacks or spin doctors. They're not telling, they're just trying to spin something however they want to make it sound really good, even if it's bad. They're trying to, turn I think the old metaphor is a sow's ear into a coin purse,
I love the movie Thank You for Smoking. because it's such great satire. Did you ever see Thank You for Smoking?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. He's a spin doctor. He spins. He's like, no. This is how we say it, and this is why it's just a really great film. But what you're talking about is absolutely one of those big myths. I'm so glad that you said that.
Yeah, I think that those are the really big ones are that it's about hype and spin and um, pulling the wool over people's eyes and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you're not going to last long in industry doing that. It's not ethical. And then I just want to mention a few other things, because some people think that okay, so you've got these Kardashians and other celebrities, and they go on tirades at award shows, or they leak sex videos to try to get publicity for their career. They do all these crazy things, and people think that that's public relations. Well, it may garner them some publicity, but I don't consider any of that ethical public relations work.
I'm glad you said self-promotion. What would a person do to help their brand? We talked about celebrities and the myth and misunderstanding of what public relations is, and how people often, do things and they call it public relations, but it's not really. What can a aspiring public relations professional do to set themselves apart and set their personal brand up as a winning brand to be hired, or to have a client approach them?
That's sort of a chicken and the egg kind of question in a sense. I mean, you got to have all the knowledge and the skills in place, but then you also have to have some experience and some track record. So that's why, many public relations professionals begin as account execs in a firm or at a company, and then they move up and they get more experience, and then they can start moving laterally or into their own practices or what have you. So it's the usual experience. And experience, by the way, is not a skill. When I ask students to list skills, experience is not a skill. You can develop experiences through skills. And time management isn't really a skill either. It's a choice. So, it's like, look, you either manage your time. Now, there are ways where you can learn to do a little bit better time management skill, but that's really a choice. And attitude is another, that work ethic, that attitude, that go-getting attitude, that I will work really hard to get this client. I will work, that's another choice. So there's choices to be made as well as skills.
What are some of the most common challenges that public relations professionals will see in their day-to-day profession?
Well, the changes and rapid advancements of technology is certainly one that we all face, period. I don't think there's an industry that's untouched by that. So that's a challenge. What are the current social, economical, political climates looking like in general, but for your industry? And of course, that can change overnight with an election or with a crisis. All of a sudden, now we've got banks failing now, which is kind of a scary thing now. There's a lot of talk about additional regulation and oversight, and so these things are moving targets. So you have to keep up with what's happening with social conditions, economic conditions, political conditions, world politics as well. I mean, there's also global public relations that we really haven't mentioned, and that's public diplomacy, which is, let's say the United States trying to present itself as this kind of a nation to other people around the world, other governments and other people. And it's kind of funny. I'm going to take another quick sidebar, but the challenge there is, how do you do something positive which appears to be altruistic? In other words, doing it because it's the right thing to do, versus egotistical, meaning it's self-serving. And the Indonesian tsunami that happened, that wiped out hundreds of thousands of people a few years ago, all these countries came to support. And China and the United States and Japan and India, all these countries were trying to support them, but they all had these really egotistical motives. And the United States was the only one who candidly admit, look, we're here helping out because when we invaded Iraq, we lost a lot of credibility with Muslims, and we're trying to restore our relationship with Muslims. So, that's really a self-serving motive, And then they got into these bidding wars. So like China saying, well, we're going to pledge this much. Well, then we're going to pledge this much more. We're going to pledge this much more. We're going to, and it was unfortunately all very egotistical. And in fact, many of those pledges were never even honored. So that's a challenge.
A broken promise is worse.
Yeah, and that's a challenge to avoid is wanting to jump in there and like use a crisis for your own, for your own publicity and reputation purposes rather than doing it for the right reason. These people need help. We're gonna do that. We're not getting on the news because that was a lot of news cycle feeding of, oh, look what we're doing, and it's like, look, the most credible story about you is written by somebody else, not by you, right? So when we do cause-related marketing and other corporate social responsibility efforts, trying to go more green and be more environmentally friendly, trying to have more diversity and inclusion, equity in the workplace, all of these things, that we were doing for corporate social responsibility, you want other people to tell your story. You don't want to be boasting about what you're doing all the time. It just sounds phony and it sounds self-serving. So those are challenges, just the changing world conditions and changing technology and the changing media landscape, with all this fragmentation, all these now, streaming channels. How do you get in there and break through the clutter? That's a huge challenge.
What are some of the specific benefits of practicing public relations for a company, for a small business, for an entrepreneur? What are those benefits?
Some of the benefits can be illustrated by some examples of what I call, preventative PR. And preventative PR is not like preventing your house from catching on fire, by having, a safe. It's ongoing corporate responsibility and community relations activities that develop a good relationship with your community, your publics, that can help you in times of need, so that you're seen as a good corporate citizen that's giving back to the community. You're not just sucking money out of it and padding your wallet, and there's real examples. The most outstanding example in my mind is McDonald's. And I'm going to tell you, back in, I think it was 1992, there was a policeman caught on tape beating this man named a black man, Rodney King. Mercilessly, and we unfortunately continue to have some of those episodes. But that video got on the news and it created an outcry like you can't believe. And there was massive rioting in South Central Los Angeles, California area. Blocks and blocks of that burned, looted, completely destroyed. Helicopters going around filming all these people ramming into appliance stores with their vans and loading up stuff, setting fire to everything. There was one business in that area that wasn't touched, and it was a McDonald's franchise. God, wasn't even touched. Right next door, everything's on fire. They weren't touched. Well, it's a good case study because the reason they weren't touched was because they had such good community relations. They gave back to the community. They supported schools. Okay, if your students get good grades, bring them in for free food. We're going to sponsor these little league teams of all different things. We're going to obviously hire from the local community, which most of those other businesses did, but that didn't save them just because diverse people from the neighborhood worked there. They had a very highly sophisticated promoted management training program. So they brought these people in and they didn't say, all right, you're going to flip burgers. You're going to get leadership training and you're going to move up in the corporation. There's all kinds of franchising. They supported women and minority-owned businesses for their supply. They did all. That's a long laundry list. There's a journal article that was written about this not too long after that said all of this good work. That the people in the community said, no, we're not going to burn and limit those people because they have contributed. They're good corporates. They do all this good stuff for our community, so we're going to leave them alone. I mean, that's like a really powerful example of that. I like another one, Southwest Airlines. Of course, they've been undergoing some issues lately with their scheduling, so forth, and that's another sort of issues management, crisis communication problem for them. So, it's easy to do public relations when, you've got a movie star or a rock star, a musician, and they're at the top. Everybody loves them, and you're promoting. That's easy. But when all of a sudden your computer crashes right during the holidays and thousands of people are stranded all over the place, that is not fun public relations, but it's absolutely essential. Anyway, this goes back to a few years ago, and it actually involved San Antonio, Texas, because there was a woman in Albany, New York, and she found this monarch butterfly in October in her yard. And she said, there's no way this monarch's going to be able to catch up with the migration and get down there. So she starts making phone calls, and so then the media kind of pick up on this. All of a sudden, Southwest Airlines said, hey, we'll fly you and your butterfly to San Antonio, where the migration is coming through right now, so that butterfly can be released and catch up with the migration pattern. That's really cool. I think it's just like, look, we're going to do something really good, and the CEO's like, even one butterfly can make a difference. So they get a little really good reputation, feel good kind of stuff out of those things.
And I can see that kind of strategy backfiring, right? Like, can't you see that kind of backfiring, that well-intentioned butterfly story being satired in the media, right? Because this sounds like an example of where it worked. But if they did it wrong, if Southwest did that wrong, and they didn't do it the right way, couldn't that backfire? That seems like a risk. There's always risk with doing these kinds of promotions, right?
It's always a risk. And I said that a lot of public relations is risk assessment. What's the likelihood? So you do have to circle around and take a 360-degree view of this. And that's the counseling role that the PR people need to do, is what could go wrong? You've heard of play devil's advocate, so in good team decision making, you always have somebody, and it's their job to poke holes in this plan and figure out every conceivable thing that could possibly go wrong, and how would I make this go wrong, so that you can build a preventative framework around that, right? So it's always a risk, and certain things can go wrong. I mean, I think, in my own personal opinion, I think Anheuser-Busch had a plausible marketing strategy to reach a particular audience, but it just backfired on them, in the sense that a lot of conservative people and traditional Bud Light drinkers really had incredibly strong reactions to it. And that news story is far bigger than the value that they were getting out of reaching that, more targeted audience with that particular spokesperson. So there's always risk. You never know. And it's learning. We all make mistakes, and if we don't learn from them, that's the biggest mistake.
A new audience versus a base. That seems like a really difficult thing to weigh. Do you have any advice for public relations professionals who are trying to attract new audiences while not alienating their base?
Pilot test your ideas out on segments of the audience that are going to be impacted by it. I always tell aspiring PR people, it may sound like a good idea, but you better test that thing out and make sure that it's going to work. And so have they tested this concept out with some more traditional type people? I think they would have heard, hey, we don't want this woke kind of ideology shoved down our throat anymore. We're tired of it. And that's in fact exactly what the boycotters are saying. And you can judge that for yourself with your own personal opinions and political, but that's what they would have heard from these people had they said, this is what we're going to do. What do you think about it? I mentioned the Big Brothers Big Sisters campaign that we were involved in, and I'm sitting there with a couple of other professors and the Big Brothers Big Sisters executives that are there in the room, and they're hearing these proposals from our campaign students. And one of the groups throws up their slogan for the campaign, and the slogan is, because size does matter. My jaw dropped. I looked at the Big Brother Big Sister, and everybody was horrified. If they had anybody in a focus group to test that out, somebody would have said, whoa, do you understand the sexual connotation that that has, and that we're talking about adults working with children? No. So you can avoid big mistakes by testing out your messages and seeing what your people that are going to be exposed to the message and possibly impacted by it. What do they think about? So always test out your ideas.
Recent studies have suggested that the polarization in our country is at an all-time high, and that we've drifted further and further away from understanding the other side, from having the same shared reality as the other side. What advice do you have for a public relations professional that is navigating this reality of having two completely different realities in our country and operating principles in our country as they craft messages that will make a difference?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's very difficult to answer because this is relatively new over the past decade or maybe a little long. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this is all of a sudden sort of just here and really severe, and it's a really big challenge because it was set up a climate. It's like you're with us or you're against us. It's you're on this side or this side. There's no, how can you be in the middle? And that's the key, is how can you stay in the middle and still make connections on both sides? And that's becoming increasingly difficult, as you know. All you can do is understand what is happening and understand what your goals are. Use the best heads that you have to come up with objective strategies and tactics. Test them out, try them out, on a low risk basis first. It's like the diffusion of innovations. Usually you got to give people some trialability before they're going to fully adopt something. You have to let people. That's why, people always had, you go test drive a car before you buy it. You get to try it out. So you got to sort of try these things out, either with a small group of people that's going to give you some sense of how this is going to go, or you just have to leap over and say, we're going to take this risk and we're going to hope for the best. And if it doesn't work, we're going to learn from that, try something else. It also doesn't hurt to look what other people are doing. There are success stories and failures out there that you can also learn from, just historical case studies. It's one of the bigger challenges.
It seems like we're almost forced to pick a side in the current climate. You have to pick, one side of the aisle or the other for your company or constituents or, clients in order to be effective almost. And I know that that's purposeful, that we got here on purpose, right? Like this has been kind of constructed for us by the current political climate, but being forced to pick a side can really wreak havoc on your business, can't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of stress because it's not. So if you're not with us all the way, you're against us, which I think is kind of nonsense. I don't have to be with a political persuasion or a political idea to be completely against it and completely for something opposite that. There's a lot of shades of gray in the middle here that we've forgotten about, it seems. So I don't have a really great answer about what to do about it, except stay tuned, be alert, always do your surveillance, your social surveillance, watch all the story. And people in public relations and in companies, they have professionals that monitor all of this stuff, monitor all the social media statements about them, all the news reports. There's LexisNexis type databases and things where you can go and see what's the news about your industry. You have to constantly surveil. And if you start seeing that there is an area where people are starting to have some issues with, you got to jump on that and respond to it. How you do that is going to be very contextual. All the public relations textbooks talk about contingency theory. What's the right thing to do? That depends on about 20 things. You have to put all these variables in there and try to, figure out what the direct effects, what the indirect, what the interaction effects. It's really complicated, and some of it can require some really statistical manipulation to make these predictions, like linear modeling and so forth of survey data. It gets pretty scientific at some levels, but that's not the exciting stuff for me.
Yeah. And all that, but hopefully that's kind of the kind of stuff that AI can take over, right?
It can certainly apply algorithms to do, systematic modeling of, if you plug in these variables, what's the outcome? They do that with weather predictions and all this other stuff too. So it's probably already here.
What are some of the most important issues or concepts related to risk communication that a public relations professional really needs to know?
Well, risk communication is obviously trying to make sure that you are communicating to affected publics. What is the risk? How severe is it? Who's going to be impacted? What should we be doing about it? Okay, so we know about risk communication through tornado warnings, hurricane warnings. Those are the really obviously, well, okay, this is going to be a really bad one. Here's the projected path. It's going to go right up the Gulf Coast and nail all these people, and you better evacuate, get your windows boarded up, So that's all kind of risk communication that we're pretty familiar with. But there's a lot of other ones like these little laundry pods that you put in your, they're little pods of laundry detergent, and they look like candy, and kids are eating them and dying. So you have to educate the media about, educate the public through the media about the risks of that and keep them away from the kid, those kind of things. Every year we have hot car campaigns trying to tell people the risks of leaving their children in a hot car in the summer, even for a minute. And yet here's story after story about somebody who went in the store, forgot, and then the child is severely injured or killed. So it's really important stuff. And even like CPS Energy, they have to educate consumers about the risks of gas leaks, electrical lines. If they get, we have recently a huge ice storm that knocked down power. Some people up in Austin were without power for a couple of weeks. These power lines people have to be educated about the risks of all of these kinds of things. So it's really important. And there's lots of other examples of that. Like if I'm going down to the beach on the coast, I go on to the Texas Beach Watch website to find out what the bacterial counts are in those, because sometimes you get those red tides of bacteria, and it's really not safe to swim in. Now, they might have red flags and everything saying it's not, but you want to be educated about that. So there's a lot of resources there about risk communication. And what you do to prepare as a PR professional is you have to think of all the things that could go wrong, as many as you can, with your engineering people, your operations managers, all the different people, your logistics people, not that you are going to be responsible for preventing this, but what are the risks that you have to be prepared to address? So there's a matrix that you use, which I actually got from a guy who ran public relations for the Red Cross. And it's, on one side, it's what's the likelihood that this could happen, from, 0 to could pretty easily happen if things go wrong. And then on the other was, what's the severity of the consequence if this happens, right? And so then you have this really nasty spot where the probability is pretty high and the damage is pretty high, and that's where you have to concentrate, the most of your efforts in terms of a crisis communication plan. So the risk communication kind of feeds into the crisis communication plan, because you know what the risks are, and therefore that helps you with your planning, so that now you know what you need to do if one of these things happen. You've got a plan in place to jump into action. Because as you know, when something happens, man, the satellite trucks and the microwave vans are going to show up with their cameras and their microphones, and they are going to be in your face. You better be ready.
Yeah, it sounds like insurance. It sounds like what you're describing is an insurance policy for entrepreneurs, businesses, organizations that helps to insure them against the guaranteed losses of being unprepared.
Yes, because it's going to be, if it's a significant enough negative event, there's going to be negative consequences, clearly, but you don't want to compound those by having a lousy PR effort that confuses people or makes them think you're hiding something or makes you look inept, that's going to compound the problem significantly.
What advice would you give your younger self in relationship to public relations?
Well, I think I probably could have benefited by being a little bit more integrated into the community. One of the first things I did when I came to San Antonio was I joined the public relations San Antonio chapter of the Public Relations Society of America, which immediately had networking possibilities. But, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of being involved with the Chamber of Commerce, other civic organizations where you network and meet people and you begin that relationship development and people start to know who you are. And now you've really got a leg up on a lot of other people that aren't. No, when you walk in a room and they know who you are, and that's a really big step up. Internships, of course, are always really going to be beneficial. Getting an internship either at a company in their marketing, communication, public relations areas, or for a public relations firm, and they're always looking for interns. And you learn as much as you put in the effort. If you just sit around and wait to be told to do something and it's kind of a slow period, and so you work on your homework, well, that's a choice you make rather than shadowing somebody or going and seeing if they have enough time to answer some questions and say, ask some of the questions you've been asking me. What are some of the challenges? What should I know? So I think that's incredibly important. And those are some of the key action items, I think, for prospective public relations people is get involved. Start at your university level, because a lot of public relations happens at the university level. In fact, we haven't really talked about all the different areas, but boy, you can work in education. I know people that work in public relations for the South Side and the North Side and Northeast Side independent school districts. Healthcare is huge. I mean, the Baptist healthcare system, Methodist healthcare system, university hospital healthcare system, they have tremendous public relations efforts and challenges in terms of educating the public about all of these different health ideas that where they can reduce their risk of having diabetes and heart attacks, all that kind of stuff. Politics, of course, is a pretty obvious one. That wouldn't be my first choice right now. I don't have a thick enough skin for that. But entertainment. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of public relations. If you're an author, you've got to have a publicist who's going to book signings for you, those kinds of things. With the media, put you on talk shows and those kind of things. If you want to publicize your book or your new film or whatever it happens to be. So the entertainment industry is huge. Many different other areas of industry require public relations people. So it's pretty wide open.
Dr. Levitt, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today to share your expertise. Where can people find you online?
Well, the easiest thing to do is find me by email. I don't have a big social media presence, so they'll have to email me at Stephen.Levitt, Lev as in Victor, ITT, at UTSA.edu, Stephen with a V. Of course, they can read a little bit about me if they go to the UTSA website and look up the communication department and go to the faculty profiles, learn a lot more about my background. And then, of course, my email link is there.
Thank you again for joining us and for taking the patience and time to explain public relations and how it all works. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Ryan. Appreciate it.